I'm George Curtis. Welcome to It's Your Environment. Each week it's my privilege to bring guests that teach all of us about our environment, what we're doing with it, what we shouldn't be doing with it, what we could be doing with it, and how we can do a better job with it, because they're not making it anymore. We've got to deal with what we have. If you're from this area or just moved here recently, you know something distinct about this part of Wisconsin and our wonderful state is water. We have a lot of water. It's probably our most precious resource. It's probably what distinguishes us from the rest of the world. And we don't always take good care of it. Fortunately, there are some stewards of the water who've dedicated their lives to making sure that we care for, stop desecrating, and maybe even improve this water. I have one of those people as my guest today, somebody that I've known for probably 20 years. He's a PhD in water. Have you ever heard of that before? I haven't. He's a doctor of water. He works as a life science. He has been a specialist with the state of Wisconsin, the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, that has a department that most of us didn't know about in water resources. He's an encyclopedia. I have at least one of his books at my home, and you've heard about him before. His name is Dr. Ron Bruch. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, George. It's a pleasure.
Well, you're not retired, but you're retired. Tell us a little bit about your career.
Well, I've worked for the DNR for 38 years. And I look back at my career, and I was so fortunate to come into the agency when I did back in the 70s. And my first appointment was actually in Oshkosh in 1976 as an intern. And I got to know Dan Foles at that time. He was the lake sturgeon biologist here in Oshkosh at the time. And he is a person that became like a second father to me throughout my whole career. But I got to know him and a number of other biologists that were some of the pioneer biologists in the state, pioneer fisheries biologists that were hired in the era after World War II, when they started bringing more and more biologists into fisheries management. And so that was really a tremendous lesson to be able to learn things from these pioneer fisheries biologists, and I was able to carry that on into my career. And then when Dan retired in 1990, then I got the Fisheries Supervisor and Sturgeon Biologist job here in Oshkosh, and carried that through to the last 3 years of my career, where I went down to Madison and worked in administration in the fisheries program. And I retired as the Chief of Fisheries of the state of Wisconsin almost 10 years ago now.
But in those 10 years, you haven't really stopped doing anything.
Now you sound like my wife. No, after I retired, I went to work for the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. They have a school called the School of Freshwater Sciences. You mentioned it in your opening. And it's really it's the only school like it in the entire country, where their whole focus is freshwater sciences, fisheries, water quality, even water security. And so I went to work for them, and had a project up in Vilas County on a lake called Long Lake near Phelps that I worked on. And so I'm doing that, and then eventually I started my own business as well, Bruch Environmental Consulting. It's just an LLC. And I do work for hydro dam owners and write reports and basically help them understand how the agencies that are administering them think, and helping them make decisions, as well as writing scientific reports for these dam owners.
Well, I'm told we have about 15,000 lakes, and we have hundreds of thousands of miles of streams, and it's our most important resource. It's what distinguishes us from the rest of the world. How would you give us a report card as to how we're taking care of this resource?
I would say the report card is fairly good. You know, when I first came to work, that was the era when the first big water quality legislation, the Federal Clean Water Act, and all that, those types of legislations that followed in the states were really just being passed in the early stages of implementation. And at that time, I vividly remember when I first went to work after my internship for the DNR in the winter, in the spring of '77. I got to lift fyke nets, the very first fyke nets I ever lifted, on the lower Fox River in Green Bay. And Lee Kernan, who was the fisheries chief, 2 chiefs before me, he was the fisheries biologist in Green Bay at that time. And the lower Fox River was more or less a cesspool. It just, nobody would even think of eating the fish out of there. Nobody would even think of fishing there. And we lifted these nets, and I couldn't believe all the fish that were in here. They were all contaminated, but I mean, beautiful walleyes and northerns and all kinds of different fish. And that was so exciting for me to see all those fish in the very first fyke net list I ever did. But the point is at that time, there were fish communities that were out there, but because the pollution was so bad, people really weren't drawn to the water to participate in these fisheries, and you couldn't eat the fish anyways. But Lee had the foresight to know that there was a lot of potential out there in Green Bay and in the lower Fox River to build a walleye fishery, and he started stocking walleye wherever he could get them from in the lower Fox River and in Green Bay. That blossomed into the world-class walleye fishery that we have in Green Bay and the lower Fox River now. And the river has cleaned up to the point that they even have whitefish runs up the lower Fox River, now, the lake sturgeon runs also, that run all the way up to the De Pere Dam. They have whitefish runs that the same thing that run up the Menominee River in Marinette. And it's just, I never thought that I would see that in my lifetime, but things have come a long ways.
Let's take our first break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about this project that you sent me some very interesting material. Northern Wisconsin, Phelps, the introduction of an invasive species that maybe isn't doing a lot of harm.
Maybe not.
We'll be right back. Welcome back to It's Your Environment. I'm George Curtis. My guest is Dr. Ron Bruch, who I've known a long time as a fisheries expert. I have his book on sturgeon. I suspect he's written some other things that I should have, but he hasn't dropped them off yet. But at least he autographed the book, and it's in my library, and it's used frequently. You're still studying fish for the benefit of our state and for all of us, and you've got a study that you sent me just about a week ago that up north. Describe it to me.
Well, there's a lake. The lake is called Long Lake. It's just outside of Phelps, Wisconsin, in Vilas County. So there's a lot of long lakes in Wisconsin, but this is a very unique lake because it's about 1,000 acres, and it's almost 100 feet deep in its deepest spot. And so and it has very steep shoreline. So it's basically what we would call a 2-story lake. It has cisco in it, which are cold water fish species related to the chubs in Lake Michigan. People buy smoked chubs. It's very similar. And it always has been known as a very good walleye lake. But back in the 90s, we figure, somebody illegally introduced smelt into the lake. And many people think that smelt were probably native to the Great Lakes, but they weren't. They were escapees from a lake that they were stocked in the lower peninsula of Michigan back in the early part of the 1900s. And they got into Lake Michigan and then scattered throughout the entire Great Lakes. And they actually become a very important forage item in the Great Lakes, and then the alewife came in later on as another forage item. So people have scattered these fish around into lakes, and even the DNR in Michigan has stocked them into lakes in the UP back 30, 40, 50 years ago. But when they get in the lake, they often become very, very abundant, and there's always been concern by the various DNRs that they may be disrupting the fisheries community in the lake because they're very voracious feeders, and they'll clean out the large zooplankton in the lake that the other fish species like to eat. They'll just wipe them out. And so it kind of changes the dynamics of the aquatic community a little bit. So we were hired, I worked for the university at the time in Milwaukee, and we were hired by the local lake district to go in there to see what kind of impact the smelt may have had on the lake, on the fish community in the lake, specifically the walleyes and the cisco, and then the lake trout that were being stocked by the DNR, whether the lake trout were utilizing them.
Okay, so that we have an interesting, somewhat unique lake in that it's so deep. So it has not only walleyes and the usual fish that we have in the state of Wisconsin, but it's so deep it has lake trout that are natives. Am I correct?
Well, they're not native, but they're stocked by the DNR, and this is a story in its own right. There's a lake not far from there, just northwest, just west of Land O'Lakes, called Black Oak Lake. And that lake has native lake trout in it. And it's a unique genetic strain to that particular lake. They're natively found in there. They're a unique genetic strain, but the numbers seem to be dwindling. So the DNR has been taking eggs and fertilized eggs from that lake and raising them in a hatchery, and then they've been stocking these lake trout in 3 other lakes in northern Wisconsin to try to establish other populations of this unique genetic strain. And so Long Lake is one of the lakes that these fish have been going into.
Now, there's another factor that I seem to recall from reading your paper, and that is the Native Americans have spearing rights.
Yes.
On this very lake. How does that complicate the formula?
Well, this is very deep in the ceded territory up north, and where the tribes have rights to go and harvest fish. And the fish of choice, of course, that they like to harvest is walleye. And Long Lake was always known as a very good walleye lake, and so they do nearly every spring they'll spear 250 to 350 walleye from this particular lake in the spring of the year. And walleye is one of the species of concern in the lake because the numbers have been going down over the years. And so that is one of the other species that the Lake District was interested in us working on, to find out what are the dynamics between the walleye and the smelt, and are the walleye reproducing anymore, because the DNR believed that once smelt get into the lake, they either eat the young walleye larvae or they somehow interrupt the reproduction of walleye in the lake. So we also were looking at that.
So there's kind of a complex background here, different interested parties with different biases. Did they all cooperate with your study?
They actually did. Yes, they cooperated very well. You know, I always when I was working in the DNR, I always said the lakes don't really care what's in them. What cares is people, and because of the people, that gives biologists jobs to go out there and try to manage these fisheries to some certain end. But the various stakeholders, the Lake District, the anglers, and the tribes, and the DNR, they were all interested in the work that we were going to do and cooperated very well.
Now, what is the role of the tribes in that particular fishery? I'm not Native American, but I can fish there. You can fish there, but there are some things that only Native Americans can fish.
Yes, they can fish for whatever they want in these lakes, but when it comes to walleyes, they negotiate with the DNR to make sure that whatever their spearing quota is, it's set up to prevent overharvest from taking place of the walleye population. But the DNR's formulas and the quotas that they set are based just on adult stock, males and females combined, and they don't really look at exploitation by sex. And the tribal fishery is primarily males because they're limited to taking fish 20 inches or less. They can only take one fish over 20 inches per spear per night when they're fishing in the spring. And then they have a cap. They can only take so many fish total in a given year from a lake. And the anglers are based, so the spears basically capture mostly males, and the anglers capture or keep mostly females because there's an 18-inch minimum size limit on the lake, and most males don't get over 18 inches, or most males are going to be under 20 inches in just about any lake up north.
So you had a number of stake players that had different interests. They cooperated, so you And your associates under the program from the University of Wisconsin and Milwaukee were able to make an honest scientific study. And after we take our next break, you're going to tell us what you found out.
Absolutely.
We'll be right back. Welcome back to It's Your Environment. I'm George Curtis, and Dr. Ron Bruch and I are talking about a special fish study that he and his associate from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee produced, and I've had the privilege of reading some of it, most of it, I think. What are the conclusions you and your partner learned?
Well, we learned first of all that in this lake, Long Lake, that the smelt were still very abundant, but they were being suppressed or affected by the predators in the lake. So the walleyes that were naturally being produced in the lake, as well as the stocked walleyes and the lake trout. And then we didn't evaluate muskie or other species, but more than likely every fish-eating species in the lake was eating smelt. And what was very interesting is that the smelt were showing a classic characteristics of a forage population that is being harvested very heavily by predators. They began maturing at about half the size and age that they normally would be maturing in the Great Lakes or other places where smelt exist. And that's pretty classic, that they're being cropped off, so the population is trying to respond to keep itself going. And the other interesting thing we found out is that in the current situation that we were examining, with the smelt somewhat suppressed and controlled by the predators, that the walleye were indeed naturally reproducing. Now we can't really, we tried to, with the study that we worked with the tribe, we tried to find out whether this is how long this has been going on, but at least back for probably 10 years we had evidence of natural walleye hatches taking place in the lake in the face of smelt. The other species that we were interested in were the cisco, because the DNR thought that somehow smelt were disrupting cisco reproduction as well. And we also found that there were cisco yearcasses being produced before the smelt come in and after the smelt came in. So it didn't look like the cisco were significantly negatively impacting cisco, or the smelt weren't impacting cisco reproduction. And probably one of the most interesting finding is we found out that the walleye in the lake, that we found out they were reproducing, but also that they were being harvested at a pretty high rate, the male walleye, not the females, but the males. And if you look at who's harvesting what in the lake, the tribal spearers are harvesting primarily males, and the anglers are harvesting primarily females because of the way the size limits are set up. And it would be easy for somebody to say, well, the doggone spearing or whatever, but that's really not the case, because the tribes basically spear through negotiated agreement with the DNR, whatever the DNR says they can spear. So they're going out there and they're exercising their rights to go out and spear. And it was really through the cooperation of the tribes that we're able to find this out.
And so you had some cooperation between competing interests that have been somewhat violent and disruptive and controversial over the years. So it shows it's possible.
It is possible. And we worked with the Mole Lake band of the Chippewa Indians. They're out of Mole Lake, Wisconsin. And just excellent people to work with. And what we did, George, is when the tribal people spear the fish in the spring, they fillet them with electric knives. And so when you get the carcass, it's got the skin hanging on it and it's got the carcass, but all the guts and everything are in it. And so we were able to get all the fish that they speared in the spring of 2021, I believe it was, yes. And we were able to measure these fish, check the sex, the maturity, the stomach contents, and collect the otoliths from the head, which we showed here on Winnebago is a very, very accurate way to tell how old these fish are. And that's the first time this had been done in the history of tribal spearing since the 80s. Nobody has ever been able to get cooperation from a tribe like this to be able to collect these carcasses and collect these data. And age is one of the most important data you can get from a fish, because from age data you can calculate mortality rates. You can look at the proportion of 3-year-olds versus 4-year-olds versus 5-year-olds all the way down the line. and you can develop a mortality curve that tells you how fast they're dying. And then you can also estimate how fast they're dying from harvest. And so we found out that the male fish were dying pretty fast from harvest, and that the sex ratio in the lake had flipped from more adult males than females, to more adult females than males. And that phenomena is occurring in a lot of the lakes up in the ceded territory, especially the stocked walleye lakes, which this is considered a stocked lake now. So it's an issue the DNR is hopefully grappling with.
What a fantastic autopsy. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could do that in many of our bodies of water in this state? What resource is half as important as our water quality and our fishery? And your study shows how complex it is. Smelt, something that I look forward to every spring.
Yep.
I didn't know what they're doing up there in Long Lake.
Right.
But they apparently this time didn't do any harm. But
it doesn't look like they've done much harm to the lake, no. But when you go over that lake with your sounder, there'll be big smelt balls. You'll see them on your sounder. So they're still pretty thick in the lake, and they provide a good forage. But the other point that I should make is the Lake District of Long Lake. It's a taxing body. They build these lake districts. They were partners in this. They funded most of this, and Walleyes for Tomorrow also funded part of this walleye study. So it really was a union or a collaboration of parties that don't normally work together like that with the tribes and the other entities. And so it just shows what can be done when you get all the parties at the table and you say, we got to do some good science here to figure out what's going on.
You've got about a minute left. You've had quite a career, and I shouldn't have used the word had. Where does it go from here?
I'm going to be like you, George. I'm just going to keep doing what I can do as long as I can. I'm still publishing papers and doing writing. As a matter of fact, we just finished a paper, a colleague of mine from Canada, on sturgeon fish passage. And we looked at passage systems in the U.S. and Canada, how much they cost, how many fish they pass, and what the efficiency rates are. And that's the first time that a paper like that has been written on any sturgeon species in the world. So I'm still keen about doing some work and trying to make a contribution.
Well, it's not a job. It's more than a profession. It's a passion.
Yep.
I think you don't like mowing the lawn any more than I do. Thank you so much for what you do.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Ron Bruch is an all-star in the history of protecting our natural resources. I was troubled when I heard that he was retiring. Fortunately, it was a false rumor. He didn't retire. I don't think he ever will retire. Protecting our natural resources is his passion. We are so fortunate to have people like Ron Bruch and other public and private servants who have made their life's work into a true crusade to fight for all of us to make our 15,000 lakes and millions of miles of streams in this state unique, precious, and better for the next generation than it was for ours. Thank you, Ron Bruch.